Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the EBR Seminar Series on the bioeconomy. Today, I'm joined by Nigel Bradly, CEO of GreenWave New Zealand. Today, we're going to be talking about the seaweed supply chain in New Zealand and how that's developed over time, as well as how that fares with other countries. Thank you for watching and enjoy the video. Thank you for joining us today, Nigel. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for asking. Okay, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about your company and farming in New Zealand. So to start us off, your company aims to create a seaweed supply chain in New Zealand. Can you kind of tell us how this company started up?
Sure. So the origins of the company go back about 4 years to an organization in the States called GreenWave. And GreenWave was established about 12 or 13 years ago in the northeast of the US, in areas where coastal fishing communities have lost access to their fish stocks. And so you've got multi-generational communities who are used to working in and on the water that no longer had the economy coming from fishing. And so Brent Smith and Emily Stengel from GreenWave founded this organization to create opportunities for those communities in regenerative ocean farming, which is focused on seaweed. I came across GreenWave about 5 years ago, and then it was mostly focused still in the Northeast, but growing across the rest of the US. And we developed a really strong relationship, and GreenWave very generously agreed to support us as collaborators in establishing GreenWave Aotearoa, or GreenWave New Zealand, and help us on the journey to creating a sustainable seaweed sector here in New Zealand, because really it didn't exist. Many of the same precursors that you see in the US with those coastal fishing communities and the ability to rely on wild caught fisheries really diminishing in the recent decades. We have the same issues here. And so a lot of the interest and the momentum from folk in this country and in many other countries is really similar to what mobilized GreenWave in the US.
So how does the current seaweed industry in New Zealand now fare with other countries?
So when we first started looking at this, the biggest difference between the GreenWave experience in the States and us was that there was literally no seaweed farming in New Zealand. You compare that with the US is relatively recent, but certainly has a growing seaweed farming industry. But if you compare it with Asia in particular, Japan, Korea, many other countries are really, you have some farms in Japan, for example, that are hundreds of years old. And so we have the comparison with New Zealand was literally not a single farm. And so we're starting a long way back, obviously, with the complete lack of experience, which is where that relationship with GreenWave in the States has been so incredibly helpful in helping us really avoid making a lot of those mistakes that a complete startup would have otherwise made, and advancing that work. So when we first we did some feasibility and investment analysis on the opportunity to create that seaweed sector in New Zealand, and the big gap, as I've mentioned, was on the farming side. But you need to think of seaweed across the entire supply chain, and really, from our perspective, is be drawn back from what the market demand is. So seaweed around the world is turned into many different types of end product: food, cosmetics, healthcare, fertilizer replacements, other agri uses. So there are many different types. And then so you need to start there and understand what are the market demands, and then what are the different types of seaweed related extracts or products that can meet those market demands, and then what species in this country do we grow with those attributes. And so working our way through that process in quite an analytical way then enabled us to identify that the big gap was in the lack of any sort of supply chain, what we call upstream. So hatcheries, which are like nurseries for plants, and then the farming, because those two elements of the supply chain just didn't exist. And so we went through that process and we designed a multi-year proof of concept that we are now almost 3.5 years into.
In conversations about farming seaweed, the term EEZ often comes up. Can you define this for us and also tell us how it relates to this conversation?
Sure. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, I think. So every country in the world has an exclusive economic zone. So it was created under the law of the sea a few decades ago. The law of the sea provided that a country's EEZ is 200 nautical miles from shore. So every country has a territorial sea, which is 12 nautical miles from shore, and then the exclusive economic zone, which is that 200 nautical mile area. New Zealand has the ninth largest in the world, partly because we have so many islands offshore. So that just keeps extending the geographic area. So then the US, France has the largest, the US I think is the second or maybe third largest. So in theory, there are enormous amounts of ocean that could be used for farming seaweed. But the reality is that seaweed, like any plant, requires nutrients. And the open ocean further out into your exclusive economic zone, the nutrient levels drop a lot because you're much further away from land. And that's typically where a lot of the nutrients are going to come from. So although in theory, we like to talk about New Zealand having one of the largest in the world, the reality is, the nutrient levels are pretty low in the vast majority of it. And B, if you think about it from both a technology and an economic point of view, you're not going to be farming something 150 miles off the coast, because you'll get big storms, which will put huge risk on your farming, and also just the costs of transport and logistics just make it unfeasible in the foreseeable future. And so what you see, there is a lot of emerging interest in what's open ocean aquaculture for seaweed farming, but the reality is still that it is relatively close to land. When you think about the scale of the exclusive economic zones, it's still much closer in than the sort of 200-mile theoretical area that you could be farming. So I think it's really important to caveat any discussions about that sort of thing with the reality that today's technology and the economics of that mean, and then the nutrient constraints really mean it's going to be very difficult. Even going 10 miles offshore, you're really exposed often to big storms, and it's still quite a long way to go. So countries that are, if you look around the countries that have been farming seaweed the longest, they're really close inshore, and they have high nutrient loading, and it's easy from a logistical point of view to get out to check your lines or to harvest or to seed lines. And so that's where the focus will be as technology advances, and there's a huge amount being done in the States through the Department of Energy, for example, is putting a lot of resource into developing the technology and capability to go further offshore. That it will happen more, but it's still an emerging topic.
Okay, so I want to kind of shift gears now and talk about your other role, where you co-led the development of a national framework for seaweed, the seaweed sector in New Zealand, and it's called the Seaweed Sector Framework. Can you give us an overview of how this framework will help boost the development of the seaweed industry in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. So based on our experience when we were creating GreenWave New Zealand and understanding the lack of a supply chain, some of the really fundamental constraints that we were facing as a country, or as a company originally, and then more broadly as a country with trying to grow the seaweed sector. We worked alongside a research organisation here called Cawthron, and we developed a national framework to guide the sector. So it was an 18-month project where the intention was to look across a range of different perspectives and understand and prioritize what we need as a country that is trying to create a seaweed framework or a seaweed sector. And what that meant was we need to think, just like I mentioned earlier with our GreenWave New Zealand early work, was starting at those markets. What is the demand going to be for products? And and then working our way back down the supply chain. It was a similar approach with the seaweed framework. We know that there are over 800 species of seaweed native to New Zealand, but we're not going to be farming all 800. So starting with the types of seaweeds that we have here for which there is demand, and then prioritizing what is the current state of the market for that particular species or different extracts from particular species, and then working our way back so that we can then prioritize what are the R&D needs that we have, how much do we understand about markets or products or different species. So that helps us think about the research needs and ultimately the priorities that we have. Then thinking about things like, because we are so new in the sector, we don't yet have a workforce that is trained and experienced in seaweed. So what are the workforce development needs that we have there? What are the sorts of supply chain logistical challenges that we have? I mentioned earlier that we're at the far end of the world. And so whilst there will be some domestic demand for seaweed products, the reality is going to be it's going to need to be an export focus. So how do we compete in an export sense with countries that are much closer to their markets that have similar species or similar product types? And so going through this, and that allowed collectively, there's a lot of input from right across the sector. It allowed us collectively to identify and agree those priorities. Another really fundamental piece in any country is the role of government. And so we have the equivalent of your state level government as well as central government or federal government in your case. And so there are, as we look to grow a sector, there are going to be a whole lot of needs of government. Some of those we have laws and regulations that are just not fit for purpose. They were created before anyone was thinking about a seaweed sector. And so for me to be able to receive seaweed off a farm, I need to be a licensed fish receiver. I need to have a fish farming license. And so those are the things that clearly, the name gives you a clue, were not developed with seaweed in mind. There are lots and lots of different roles. So we went through a process there also working with different government agencies to identify what the current state of our regulations is, what the needs of the future are, and then prioritize what changes need to be made. And so the whole idea was we end up with a series of different perspectives in this seaweed framework. R&D, the supply chain needs, the workforce needs, the government needs, and we can then put all of that together into a relatively short, I think it's about 30-page document that we can then, that summarizes everything and really critical, I think, when any country is looking at this, you've got to be able to and willing to prioritize. And that's not always easy because you've got lots of competing interests, but no country that is getting into the sector or trying to grow the sector can do everything. And so I think it is absolutely essential to go through that process of prioritizing, which means ultimately you're picking some winners and some losers. But you can't have a coherent, consistent framework to apply to growing that seaweed sector sustainably if you haven't gone through a prioritization process. We in this country, our Indigenous people, Māori, are critical and are involved in all aspects of seaweed sector. And so there was a big part of this framework was also working with different tribes and organizations to understand their priorities, where they want to fit, where the opportunities are, what the constraints are, and what the obligations are of the sector as it grows, but also of the government in relation to Māori and growing the sector. So that was released about 2.5 years ago. It's been really helpful, I think, from my point of view as GreenWave New Zealand and running that growing business. It's really helpful to be able to look back on something that was developed not just as a company strategy, but actually as more of a strategic framework for the entire country and where it wants to go, and then seeing where, and at times it might mean we need to tweak what we're doing to make sure that we're really trying to stay consistent with that overall framework. And we're able, we are by no means the only organisation in the sector. There are many organisations in the sector, and it's growing. But having, I think, our role, because we're lucky enough to have been involved in co-leading that development of the seaweed framework, and our role in leading the creation of that supply chain, we're in a really unique position to understand where everything fits in. And it's very dynamic. So over time, you want to revise that framework to make sure that what we thought was a priority 2, 3, 5 years ago is still a priority. There'll be emerging priorities. And if you think about things like climate change is a really good example. What is that warming water, storm, increasing frequency of storms, all of that sort of thing, and also sort of the approach from different governments around the world to how they are dealing with climate change, are all going to influence our seaweed sector, whether we like it or not. And so we have to be able to recognise it's a dynamic sector, and whatever we're doing as an individual company with GreenWave New Zealand, or at that sort of more strategic country level, we've got to be able to keep adapting that to stay ahead of things, and otherwise we'll really struggle. And you see in some countries, some of the tropical countries in Asia, for example, that have historically had really low tech, very, very much inshore approaches to seaweed harvesting, are really struggling with climate change. The water is getting too warm in some countries for the growth to occur. And so it's very difficult for them to adapt because they're so entrenched in the way in which they've always done it. We're lucky in that regard, and the US is too, because it's still very much an emerging sector. And so being really smart about seeing things, adapting to them, and then recognizing how that all influences what the priorities are for the sector, for individual organizations or people within the sector, for governments. I think, and that's the real value in having that broad strategic approach that we took.
Okay, thank you. Well, that does it for all of our questions. Thank you for this conversation and explaining the current seaweed industry in New Zealand. And also thank you for your efforts in trying to expand that industry. This was a super good conversation, and we thank you again, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for checking out the EBI seminar series on the bioeconomy and the seaweed supply chain. If you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on the macroalgae bioeconomy. Be sure to follow along for future installments, or check out our previous series, and explore our social media, which are all linked in the description below. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.